Okay, well, let's see. I'd like to look at Matthew's Gospel today in chapter 7, and there's one verse I'd like to read here. Matthew chapter 7, verse 17. And rather than read the whole big giant passage, I think I'll just read this one verse and talk about it. Matthew's Gospel chapter 7, verse 17, Jesus is talking, and he says, "Even so, every good tree bringeth forth good fruit, but a corrupt tree bringeth forth evil fruit." Now, of course, I think we understand, without reading the verses around it to get the context, but just from this, I think we understand that he's not talking about trees. He's using trees as an example for people and for lives. Isn't that right? I think that's what's meant by that. So we have, let's look at it again. Every good tree brings forth good fruit, and every corrupt tree brings forth evil or corrupt fruit. So we have a good tree, and Jesus says good trees bring forth good fruit. That's pretty simple. I mean, isn't that what he says? And a corrupt tree brings forth corrupt fruit. So if we have, there's two elements to it. There's the tree and there's the fruit, right? So we could talk about the tree, or we could talk about the fruit. What we do mostly, see the fruit, what does fruit refer to? Fruit refers to what's on the outward evidence. That's what he's talking. And in fact, in the context, we might as well read that and get the idea. I wasn't that I wanted to avoid that. He's talking about false prophets. Verse 15, he says, "Beware of false prophets, which come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravening wolves." He's saying, beware of people that, he said, you can be deceived on the outside, wearing sheep's clothing, which a sheep seeming mild-mannered and innocent and harmless, but on the inside, ravening wolves. It's quite a difference, you see. So he's saying, beware of that, and he's calling your attention to it. Then he says, "You shall know them by their fruits. Do men gather grapes of thorns or figs of thistles?" Then he says, the verse we read, "Even so, every good tree bringeth forth good fruit, but a corrupt tree bringeth forth evil fruit." And then he sums it up by saying, "A good tree cannot bring forth evil fruit, neither can a corrupt tree bring forth corrupt fruit." So, here's what happens, though, in life. Just the way we think in our religious part of our minds. If we see, if we want to say that corrupt fruit or bad fruit means, let's just say it could mean bad actions or bad behaviors or bad habits or bad, anything bad that we see in our lives, we could say that's what's meant by bad fruit. Is that fair to say? And so what we think is, here's the way we think. I've got this thing in my life that I recognize is a bad fruit. And especially if you go to church very long and hear a lot of preaching about all the bad things, and you get a finger pointed at you long enough, all these things are pointed out to you. Hello, everybody. Nice to see you. Hi, Lily. Hi, Summer.
Good morning.
Good morning to you. We're just talking about trees this morning. Trees and fruit. And let me read it one more time. Could you give me verse 17 again, Elliot? This is the main verse that I was reading. "Every good tree bringeth forth good fruit, and a corrupt tree brings forth evil fruit." And so I was just making the comment that corrupt fruit or bad fruit, let's say it that way in ordinary language, can stand for or represent bad actions, bad behavior, something bad in our lives. And here's what happens. We look at these things, and when we come to acknowledge or recognize them, we think, here's what we think: I've got to do something about that. That's logical. That makes a certain kind of sense. I have got to do something about that. Especially on New Year's Eve, when everybody makes New Year's resolutions. Do you do that in China, Lily? Is it on Chinese New Year? Do you make in Western New Year on New Year's Eve, everyone makes resolution or promises. Like, next year I'll promise to do better. Like that. I don't know if you have that in Chinese New Year.
No.
Well, that's good.
My family, they don't.
Yeah. Right. It's a good thought. I mean, I don't know how that practice got started, but on New Year's Eve, everyone makes New Year. Next year, I will do better. I'm going to go out and exercise every day. That's one. I've done that one, and that goes pretty good for about a week, right? Or we make all kinds of promises because we recognize about our lives sometimes that there are things that need attention or things that need to be changed. And so we think it's up to us to do them. And, it's right that we give some attention to those things. But you see, ultimately, it goes deeper than just something that we can change. Here's an analogy. Here's an example. Let's just say, Jesus is talking about trees and fruit here. Let's just say, this is an illustration. Let's just say that you had a tree and it had bad fruit on it. And let's just say that you recognize that this tree has bad fruit. And so you think to yourself, I've got to fix that. I've got to do something about that. So you could get a long ladder. And if it's been growing a while, it might be a pretty big tree by now. So you could get a big ladder and you could start pulling the bad fruit off. You could do that. It's a lot of work. Because once you've pulled it off this part, you've got to move the ladder around, work over here, move around over here, and pretty soon you go all the way around the tree. You could do it. If it's a big tree, it's going to be a lot of work. You could pull all the bad fruit off. But now you've got a barren tree with no fruit, so you need to have some good fruit in its place. And you understand that I'm using fruit as, like Jesus does, as an analogy for life or actions or behavior. So you want to have some good ones in its place, so if you could use enough energy to get all the bad, and that's a challenge because once you've gone all the way around, it's sprouting up over here again. You worked over here and it's sprouting up over there. And that's true in life too. So let's just say you could pull all the bad, you could correct all the bad behavior. And let's just say now you've got a barren tree and you need good fruit. Well, you've got to get something in its place. How are you going to do that? Well, you could go to Hobby Lobby or Lowe's or somewhere like that and get some artificial fruit. Have you ever seen the artificial fruit they have nowadays? It's pretty good looking. It looks good enough to eat sometimes. They have some nice looking artificial fruit. So you can go to Hobby Lobby and buy a lot of artificial fruit, and you can get a glue gun or something and get up there on the ladder. And this would really be pain. You thought it was hard pulling off the bad fruit. Now you try to glue some artificial fruit on. But let's just say that you could. Let's just imagine that you had a lot of energy and you were really dedicated to this thing. I'm turning over a new leaf. I'm going to get rid of this bad stuff and put something good in its place. If you could do that, pull all the bad fruit off and glue on something that you've got somewhere, some artificial fruit. Now what you've got, after all that work, you've got an artificial tree. You've got something phony, right? You see, this is why Jesus talks about these people in his day called the Pharisees. They were very strict. They were strict observers of the law of Moses. And they outwardly appeared. Well, let me just show you something that he says. Look in chapter 23 of Matthew. We're in Matthew 7 here. Look in 23 of Matthew, where Jesus, the Pharisees were always criticizing Jesus, always picking at him, and they always had were finding fault with him. And so finally, he just kind of let them have it. And Matthew chapter 23, listen to this. He says, verse 25. Let's start reading there. Matthew chapter 23, verse 25. First word is woe. And woe, that's not just what you say to make the horse stop going. Woe here means bad news. Bad. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. This is interesting. Why is he pronouncing woe or bad? He's condemning them here. For you make clean the outside of the cup and the platter. Stop right there. He gives them credit for making clean. Again, he's using an analogy, a cup and a platter. He said, you've cleaned the outside of the cup. In other words, he's using that to represent their lives. He said, you have cleaned the outside. Just like I said before, you could take all the bad fruit off, put good fruit on its place. He gives them credit for that. You have cleaned the outside, but he says within they are full of extortion and excess. Thou blind Pharisee, cleanse first. Now notice the word first there. First meaning in first place or in place of priority. The most important part is that which is within. Cleanse first that which is within the cup and the platter, that the outside of them may be clean also. Now here he says, if you would clean what's on the inside first, then the outside would, and I'm going to add the word eventually, the outside would come to reflect what's on the inside. Now is that very much like what he said back in Matthew when he said a good tree cannot bring forth bad fruit? That's very much the same thing. He said, woe unto you, verse 37, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you are like whited sepulchres, that's a grave, but it's painted white, which indeed appear beautiful outward, but within are full of dead men's bones and all uncleanness. Now he's saying to them, you are hypocrite. A hypocrite means phony, right? Just like I described that tree a while ago. You could make a tree that looked good by pulling off all that was bad and gluing on artificially what looks good, but what you would have is something phony. Because while we could talk about that analogy of the tree and the fruit, see, all I've been doing right now is focusing on the fruit. That's what we tend to do. We see the behaviors. But you see, there's another solution to it. Now,